Hi, and welcome back to True Crime Echoes, where we explore the darkest corners of real life crimes and the haunting human stories that live within them. Today's case isn't just disturbing, it's complicated. It's one of those stories that makes you question everything you think you know about innocence, guilt, love, and survival. It begins with a girl in a wheelchair, a devoted single mother, and a community full of sympathy. But as we'll learn, not everything was what it seemed. This is the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of her mother Dee Dee. And it's not just a crime. It's a tragedy built on deception, control, and desperation, one that forces us to ask, what would you do if your entire life was a lie? Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Couldn't Walk. Until she did you know how. Sometimes when something seems too bizarre to be true, your brain just refuses to believe it. That's exactly how I felt when I first learned about Gypsy Rose Blanchard. For years, people saw her as a fragile little girl in a wheelchair tethered to oxygen tubes and feeding tubes with a long list of terrifying diagnoses: leukemia, muscular dystrophy seizures, developmental delay. She looked like a child even when she was well into her 20s. She sounded like one too, soft-spoken, high-pitched, sweet. But here's the thing. One day, Gypsy stood up and walked, just like that. No wheelchair, no oxygen, no trembling hands. She walked strong, clear-eyed, fully alert, and the world stopped breathing. Because the woman who had been by her side her entire life, her mother, Claudine D.D. Blanchard, was found dead, stabbed to death in her bed. And suddenly this so-called angelic mother who'd cared for her terminally ill daughter turned into something else entirely. A villain, a manipulator, a woman who may have spent decades torturing her own child under the guise of love. I remember thinking, how did no one see it? How could so many doctors, charities, neighbors, and even her own father miss the truth? And what does it take for a daughter to believe the only way out is through murder? This case isn't just about a girl who walked after years of being told she couldn't. It's about control, identity, and the devastating line between victim and perpetrator. So today I want to tell you the story of Gypsy Rose and Dee Dee Blanchard. Not just the headlines, not just the courtroom drama, but the sick, sad, strange layers of it all. Let's start from the beginning. Chapter 2. A Daughter. Made of diagnoses. When you grow up being told you're sick, really, truly sick, what choice do you have but to believe it? From the very beginning, Gypsy Rose Blanchard's life was defined by illness, or at least that's what everyone believed. Her mother, Dee Dee, painted a heartbreaking picture of her daughter's condition. According to her, Gypsy suffered from leukemia, muscular dystrophy, severe asthma, epilepsy. She had the mental capacity of a child and needed a feeding tube, an oxygen tank, and a wheelchair. It was an endless list, and somehow it just kept growing. I think what struck me the most was how convincing Dee Dee was. To doctors, to neighbors, to charities, to the media. She had this soft-spoken, gentle demeanor, always smiling, always nurturing. People didn't just believe her, they adored her. She was the epitome of a devoted single mother doing everything for her poor, helpless child. But that image, it was a carefully constructed illusion. Because Gypsy wasn't helpless, and she wasn't nearly as sick as people thought. In fact, some of the illnesses Dee Dee claimed, like the muscular dystrophy and seizures, had never been medically confirmed. Some doctors even questioned the symptoms, but Dee Dee had an answer for everything. Lost records. Katrina destroyed the paperwork. Specialists misdiagnosed her. She was always one step ahead. And Gypsy, she believed it too, for years. Imagine being told every single day that your body is broken, that you can't eat without a tube, that you'll die if you try to walk, that your father abandoned you, that the world is too dangerous for someone as fragile as you. That kind of conditioning doesn't just shape how you see the world, it becomes your world. Gypsy's body might have been perfectly capable, but her mind had been caged for so long that she didn't know what freedom felt like. And Dee Dee made sure of that. Chapter 3. The Woman Behind the Mask. To understand Gypsy's story, we have to look at the woman who shaped every piece of it, her mother, Claudine Blanchard. Everyone knew her as Dee Dee. And let me tell you, Dee Dee was complicated. She was born Claudine Peter in Louisiana, and even as a child, people said there was something off about her. She was manipulative. She lied easily. She stole things that didn't belong to her petty stuff, but frequent enough that her family noticed. And as she got older, those patterns didn't just fade away. They evolved. In her 20s, she worked as a nurse's aide, which looking back is unsettling. Someone like Dee Dee, with access to vulnerable people in a caregiving role, it's almost too on the nose. There were even whispers that when her own mother got sick, Dee Dee may have played a part in her decline. Nothing ever proven, of course, but family members suspected she was withholding food or even poisoning her. Again, no charges. Just quiet suspicions. But the pattern, it was there. Then at 24, Dee Dee got pregnant by a 17-year-old named Rod Blanchard. They got married, maybe out of obligation, maybe to do the right thing. But Rod later said he knew it wasn't going to work. He left before Gypsy was even born. From that moment on, Dee Dee had what she wanted, a child to call her own, to control, to center her world around. And not long after Gypsy's birth in 1991, Dee Dee began telling people that something wasn't quite right with her baby, that she wasn't developing properly, that she had breathing problems. And the diagnoses started piling up, some real, some invented, and some impossible to verify. And here's where things start to get blurry. Was Dee Dee just a mother who was overly cautious? Was she traumatized, misguided? Or was she someone who thrived on the attention that came with tragedy, the donations, the sympathy, the praise from strangers, the way people called her brave and strong and devoted? It's easy to look back and say, how did no one see it? But manipulation. Real manipulation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's soft-spoken, wrapped in pink blankets and medical jargon, walking beside a wheelchair and smiling. Dee Dee didn't just lie. She built an entire identity around those lies, and Gypsy. She was the centerpiece of it all. Chapter 4. Diagnoses, drugs, and a life manufactured. It didn't happen overnight. Dee Dee didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to turn her daughter into a living, breathing prop in a medical tragedy. No, it built up slowly, deliberately over time. A little lie here, a small exaggeration there, until it snowballed into a full-blown alternate reality. When Gypsy was just 3 months old, Dee Dee claimed she had sleep apnea. Doctors ran tests and found nothing wrong. But that didn't stop Dee Dee. She insisted something was wrong. And that pattern of Dee Dee rejecting medical facts in favor of her own version of events would repeat again and again. As Gypsy got older, her diagnoses multiplied. Leukemia, asthma, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, vision and hearing problems. She was put on anti-seizure medications, fed through a tube fitted with oversized glasses, and eventually placed in a wheelchair. Not because she needed one, but because her mother said she did. I think that's what makes this story so haunting. Dee Dee didn't just claim Gypsy was sick, she made her sick. She shaved Gypsy's head regularly so it would look like she was undergoing chemo. She had doctors insert feeding tubes, she pushed for surgeries, she filled her cabinets with medications and sometimes even gave Gypsy drugs she didn't need. Drugs that made her lethargic, confused, barely functional. And if anyone questioned it, Dee Dee had answers locked and loaded. She said Katrina had destroyed Gypsy's medical records. She moved often, making it hard for doctors to compare notes. She charmed hospital staff with her sweet, concerned demeanor, presenting herself as a mother, doing everything in her power to care for her poor disabled child. And the most terrifying part? It worked. Dee Dee played the system like a master manipulator. Doctors accepted her explanations. Charities stepped in to help. They got free flights, free trips, a house built by Habitat for Humanity, complete with a wheelchair ramp and a hot tub. The media loved them. Communities rallied around them. And all the while, Gypsy was sitting in a chair she didn't need, drugged and isolated from the outside world, being told every single day that she was broken. She couldn't go to school. She had no real friends. She believed she was younger than she actually was. Her mom controlled everything, her food, her clothes, her medication, her information, her identity. And the truth is, Gypsy didn't even know what was real anymore. I think that's what people misunderstand about this case. It wasn't just physical abuse, it was psychological warfare, it was erasure. Dee Dee didn't just want a sick daughter, she wanted a daughter who couldn't leave, a daughter who needed her, who could never grow up or grow away. And the scariest part, it worked for almost 2 decades. Chapter 5. America's Sweethearts of Suffering. From the outside looking in, they were the picture of perseverance. A devoted single mother and her gravely ill daughter, battling through unimaginable challenges, smiling in the face of pain, and somehow always surviving. People loved them. After Hurricane Katrina hit in 2005, Dee Dee claimed they'd lost everything: their home, their possessions, and most importantly, Gypsy's medical records. It was the perfect narrative. Not only was Gypsy terminally ill, but now they were disaster survivors too. Sympathy poured in. They were relocated from Louisiana to Missouri, and in 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them a brand new home. It was pink, small, and perfectly suited for Gypsy's needs, complete with a wheelchair ramp, a walk-in shower, and a hot tub. The kind of place you see on feel-good news segments. Dee Dee made sure they stayed visible. She brought Gypsy to charity events, children's hospitals meet, and greets with celebrities. There were photos of Gypsy with Miranda Lambert Disney characters and smiling doctors. The media called them brave, inspirational. Dee Dee was hailed as a selfless caregiver, the kind of mother most people only dream of being. But here's the thing, none of it was real. Behind every cheerful photo, there was a carefully constructed performance. Dee Dee knew how to talk to people, how to keep the attention on the tragedy, on the struggle, on the heartbreak. She told stories about late-night hospital visits, feeding tubes, seizures, brain surgeries. And when Gypsy spoke, it was always childlike, rehearsed, monitored. Dee Dee never let her speak freely. She was always there, holding her hand, answering for her, smiling too hard. Looking back now, it's almost like watching two actors in a long-running play. One of them didn't know they were acting. What makes it worse is how easy it was to believe. Because when we see someone suffering, especially a child in a wheelchair, we want to help. We want to believe we're looking at courage, not cruelty. And Dee Dee knew that. She used people's goodness against them. And it worked. They got free flights to doctors across the country, all expenses paid vacations to Disney World, VIP access at concerts, fundraisers, donations. Dee Dee had crafted the perfect illusion, the suffering daughter and the saintly mother. But behind closed doors, that illusion was cracking. Gypsy was growing older. She was starting to ask questions. She wanted more than birthday balloons and charity gifts. She wanted truth. She wanted freedom. And slowly, she was starting to figure out that everything she knew about herself was a lie. Chapter 6. The Invisible Cage. The thing about control is it doesn't always look like a locked door or a raised voice. Sometimes it comes in the form of a gentle hand squeeze, a whispered reminder, a constant, quiet threat disguised as love. That was Dee Dee's specialty. As Gypsy got older, things started to feel off. She didn't understand why her body didn't feel as weak as her mother claimed, why she could move her legs when she was alone, but had to stay in a wheelchair in public, why she couldn't eat solid food at home, but somehow didn't get sick when she snuck a candy bar. She started to realize her life didn't add up, but any time she tried to speak up, even just a little Dee Dee shut it down fast. If they were in public, she'd tighten her grip on Gypsy's hand, just enough to send a message. And behind closed doors, it was worse. Gypsy would later say that her mother hit her with coat hangers, slapped her across the face, withheld food, punished her for asking questions. And the cruelest part of it all, Dee Dee convinced her that no one would ever believe her. She told Gypsy that her dad was a deadbeat, that doctors were too dumb to understand her condition, that even the police couldn't be trusted. And when authorities did come knocking, like that one anonymous tip that triggered a wellness check, Dee Dee had an answer ready. She said she was hiding from an abusive ex. That's why the names and birth dates didn't match. That's why the story seemed odd. She spun it all so well, and the police believed her. They left. Case closed. And once again, Gypsy was trapped. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had no access to her own records, no idea how old she really was. Dee Dee kept changing her birth date, telling others Gypsy was several years younger than she actually was. And when her biological father, Rod, tried to stay in touch, sending birthday presents, making phone calls, Dee Dee intercepted everything. She told Rod not to mention Gypsy's real age, told him Gypsy wouldn't understand, told him it would upset her. And so Gypsy lived in this bubble, frozen in time, treated like a child long after she became a woman. I can't imagine what that does to your sense of self when you're constantly told you're incapable, too sick, too fragile, too broken to function in the real world. When your only source of information is the very person controlling your life. People like to say, why didn't she just leave? But where would she go? What proof did she have? Who would believe the wheelchair-bound girl with the feeding tube who talked like a child claiming she wasn't actually sick? Dee Dee made sure that no one would ever believe her. Because that's how abusers operate. They don't just isolate you from the world, they reshape it. And by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late. And for Gypsy, the clock was ticking. She was getting older, her body healthy, her mind awakening, and for the first time in her life, she started thinking the unthinkable, maybe the only way out, was to destroy the person who kept her in. Chapter 7, A Doctor's Doubt. You know what's terrifying? How close this whole thing came to being stopped. Years before the murder, years before Gypsy had to take matters into her own hands. One person saw through it, just one. And still, nothing changed. It was 2009, maybe 2010, when Gypsy and Dee Dee met with a neurologist in Missouri, someone who was thorough professional and thankfully skeptical. He reviewed Gypsy's long list of diagnoses. He listened to Dee Dee describe seizures, muscular dystrophy, cognitive delays, and something didn't sit right. So he did what any good doctor would do. He ran tests, MRIs, blood work, a full workup, and the results, completely normal. No signs of muscular dystrophy, no brain abnormalities, no reason why Gypsy couldn't walk. He asked Dee Dee, why is she in a wheelchair? Dee Dee didn't like that. She got defensive, abrupt. The sweetness faded. And just like that, she pulled Gypsy out of the office and never came back. That doctor would later write in his report that he suspected Munchausen syndrome by proxy, that he believed Dee Dee was intentionally fabricating or causing Gypsy's illnesses. He documented it, put it in writing. He even made calls trying to get past records, trying to piece the truth together, but nothing happened. Why? Because when he brought it up to his colleagues, they told him to drop it, let it go. The Blanchards were well known. Dee Dee was loved. People donated money, built them a house, held fundraisers. No one wanted to believe that the sweet, smiling mother who cared so deeply for her daughter was actually her jailer. So the system failed. It didn't just fail Gypsy. It failed the truth. It failed every person who trusted that something as serious as medical child abuse would be taken seriously when reported. The doctor who raised the red flag. He tried. He really did. But one voice wasn't enough to break through Dee Dee's carefully constructed wall of sympathy lies and paperwork. Because paperwork, God, Dee Dee had so much paperwork, she was meticulous. She kept binders, forged records, altered birthdays, and used Katrina as a catch-all excuse whenever anyone questioned why nothing added up. And the worst part is she didn't even need to be a genius to pull it off. She just had to stay one step ahead of people who didn't want to look too closely. That doctor was the closest thing Gypsy had to a lifeline. And when that failed, when even that didn't lead to help, I think something inside her started to die. Hope. Trust. Maybe even the idea that the world could ever help her. Because if the system didn't believe her, then why would it believe her later? And when your world is reduced to survival, sometimes survival starts to look a lot like escape. Even if that escape means blood. Chapter 8. A Screen and a Secret Life. They say the internet can be a window to the world. For Gypsy, it was more than that. It was her only way out. By the time she was a teenager, though, no one knew exactly what age she truly was. Gypsy had started to sense that something about her life wasn't right. But it wasn't until her mom went to sleep each night, often knocked out by her own medications, that Gypsy could sneak over to the computer. That glowing screen became her world. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She didn't have friends. She had no phone of her own, no private conversations. But online, she could be anyone. She could talk. She could ask. She could start peeling back the layers of lies that had wrapped around her since birth. And it was during one of those late-night sessions that she met him, Nicholas Godejohn, on a Christian dating site of all places. At first, it was innocent. Just two lonely people talking, flirting, connecting. But the more they spoke, the more intense it got. Gypsy had never had someone pay attention to her like that. Someone who didn't treat her like a child or a patient or a burden. Nick told her he loved her, that he understood her, that he wanted to save her. And she believed him. But Nick wasn't a savior. He had his own problems, mental illness, a criminal record, and disturbing fantasies. He told Gypsy about his multiple personalities, some of whom were violent or sadistic. He introduced her to BDSM. They began role-playing through messages using alter egos, slipping into a world of control and submission, one that eerily mirrored her real life. Only this time she chose to play along. And I think that's where things get murky. Because for Gypsy, the line between control and consent had been blurred for so long, she couldn't tell the difference anymore. Was she exploring freedom or just finding a new cage? She would later say that being with Nick online in secret made her feel powerful, wanted, like she finally had control over something, anything. And yet from the outside, you can't help but see how deeply vulnerable she was, how easily manipulated. She even started creating alternate Facebook accounts to talk to him in private. She'd post photos of herself in costumes and wigs, slipping into characters, living a life her mother would have never allowed. Some of those photos, in hindsight, are hard to look at, because you realize this wasn't just rebellion. It was escape. It was her only way to exist outside of Dee Dee's story. But the thing about secret lives is they don't stay secret forever. And the more Gypsy confided in Nick, the more desperate their conversations became. She told him the truth, that she wasn't sick, that she could walk, that her mother had kept her prisoner her whole life. And somewhere in those late-night exchanges, a dark idea started to take shape. What if Nick wasn't just her boyfriend? What if he was her way out? And what if the only way out was to get rid of her mother for good? That's when fantasy started bleeding into reality, and reality was about to turn deadly. Chapter 9. A Fairy Tale. Meeting with a Dark Twist. By the time Gypsy and Nick had been talking for a while, the line between fantasy and reality wasn't just blurred, it was almost gone. She wanted to meet him, in person, not just through a screen or through secret Facebook messages, but for real, to look him in the eyes and feel like, for once, something in her life was actually hers. Not controlled, not filtered through Dee Dee, just hers. But of course, nothing in Gypsy's life was ever simple, especially not relationships. So they made a plan. It was strange, awkward, honestly kind of sad when you think about it. They would accidentally bump into each other at a movie theater. Gypsy and Dee Dee were going to see the new Cinderella live-action film. Nick would be there too alone. Gypsy would strike up a casual conversation pretending she didn't know him. Then she'd invite him to sit with them. Maybe, just maybe, Dee Dee would like him. It sounds naive, doesn't it? Like something a child would dream up. Because in many ways, Gypsy still was a child, at least emotionally. She had no idea how relationships really worked, no idea how to gauge danger, no template for what was safe or normal or healthy. The plan went forward. They met at the theater, sat together. Dee Dee was immediately uncomfortable. A grown man sitting alone at a Disney movie. It didn't feel right to her. She was suspicious, cold. The whole setup unraveled almost instantly. But what happened next was even more disturbing. Gypsy and Nick reportedly snuck away to a bathroom during the movie and had sex. Some reports say it was consensual, others suggest Gypsy felt pressured. Either way, it was a pivotal moment because it marked the first time their secret online relationship became physical. And from there, things escalated fast. Dee Dee wanted nothing to do with Nick. She called him creepy. She warned Gypsy to stay away, but the damage was done. They'd already crossed the line. Behind the scenes, Gypsy continued talking to Nick, sharing her fears, her pain, her desperation. She told him everything about her mother's abuse, the fake illnesses, the years lost to lies and pills and isolation. And Nick listened. He told her he loved her, that he would protect her, that he would do anything for her, and eventually that promise turned dark. Because when Gypsy said, "I don't know how to get away," Nick offered a solution. What if I kill her? At first, it was just a thought, a fantasy, a way of expressing loyalty twisted but distant. But Gypsy didn't shut it down. She didn't say no, because in her world there had never been another way out. So they talked about it, planned. And the next time Dee Dee raised her voice or withheld food or tightened her grip on Gypsy's fragile world, Gypsy made a decision. She messaged Nick. "Okay, I want to do it. I want you to kill my mom. It's chilling to say it out loud, even now." But I don't think Gypsy fully understood what she was setting in motion. I don't think either of them did. Because when you live inside a fantasy for too long, you forget that real life has consequences. And very soon those consequences were coming. Chapter 10. The night it all ended. There's something surreal about the moment a fantasy becomes real. It's not loud like in movies. It's quiet, cold, detached. And that's exactly what happened the night Gypsy let Nick into her home. It was June 2015. Gypsy had prepared everything. Dee Dee was asleep in her bed. The front door was squeaky, so she warned Nick to be careful. She had already laid out the supplies for him: gloves, duct tape, a knife. It sounds so methodical when you say it out loud. Almost like a script, but that's what this had become. A twisted script they were both following. Gypsy said Nick told her to go hide in the bathroom, cover her ears, and wait. And she did. She didn't see what happened next, but she heard it. She heard her mother scream her name, Gypsy, as she woke up and saw a stranger standing in her room. And then she heard the stabbing. Over and over. She would later say she lost count. That it went on too long. That she sat in the bathroom, hands over her ears, sobbing. Because whatever she had imagined this would be, it wasn't this. After it was done, Nick came into the bathroom. And what happened next, depending on whose version you believe, is either heartbreaking or horrifying. Gypsy said he raped her. Nick said it was consensual. They had sex in her bedroom right after her mother had been murdered just steps away. It's one of the darkest details in this whole case, not just because of what it was, but because of what it symbolized. There was no celebration, no relief, just silence and shock, and the kind of emptiness you can't prepare for. They cleaned up what they could, took about $4,000 Dee Dee had hidden in the house, packed suitcases, called a cab, and just like that, they left. 2 kids with too much luggage and too little plan. They checked into a motel for a few nights, ate fast food, tried to act normal. Gypsy dyed her hair. Nick mailed the murder weapon back to his home in Wisconsin so it wouldn't be found at the scene. It's hard to even wrap your head around that, how methodical parts of this were while everything else was unraveling. Then they took a Greyhound bus north. Gypsy was finally free. No more pills, no more wheelchair, no more oxygen tanks or feeding tubes. She could eat what she wanted, walk on her own, sleep without fear. But she didn't feel free, because freedom bought with blood doesn't feel like freedom at all. I think in that motel room for the first time, Gypsy realized what they had actually done. This wasn't a fantasy anymore. This wasn't just a plan whispered in the dark. Her mother was dead, and now they were fugitives. And somewhere deep down, Gypsy knew this story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 11. That bitch is dead. For a few days, no one knew anything. Dee Dee's body was still inside the house. The curtains were drawn. The front door remained closed. And the neighbors just assumed that the Blanchards, this sweet, inseparable mother and daughter, were off on another medical trip or charity event. But Gypsy was growing anxious. She thought someone would have found her mom by now. She was checking online, watching and waiting. And when days passed without a word, something shifted in her. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was some twisted need to take back control of the narrative. Whatever it was, it led her to do something no one could have expected. She logged into her mother's Facebook account, and she posted 3 words that would change everything. That bitch is dead. It hit like a lightning bolt. Friends, family, neighbors, everyone saw it. At first, people thought it was a hack or some sick joke. But then a second message appeared in the comments. This one was even worse, crude, violent, and very, very real. It was enough to send neighbors rushing over to the house. They knocked. No answer. They peered through windows, but they were covered in a privacy film, no way to see inside. Still, something felt wrong. Dee Dee's car was in the driveway, her wheelchair ramp untouched. And then someone noticed something chilling. Gypsy's wheelchair was still inside. And that changed everything. Because if Gypsy couldn't walk, where was she? The police were called. They entered the home. Everything seemed neat, in place, until they reached Dee Dee's bedroom. That's where they found her. Face down in her bed, covered in stab wounds, decomposing, and no sign of Gypsy. What had started as a welfare check suddenly became something far more terrifying, a possible kidnapping. Investigators feared Gypsy had been taken by whoever killed Dee Dee. They believed she was in danger, vulnerable, without her medication, without her mother. They didn't know that Gypsy was more than fine. She was hundreds of miles away, walking freely, eating what she wanted, sleeping in a motel bed next to the man who had killed her mother. She wasn't missing. She had run. But the internet leaves breadcrumbs. Always. Police traced the IP address from the Facebook posts. It led them straight to Nick's home in Wisconsin. And within hours, the story unraveled. They knocked on the door. Gypsy answered. No wheelchair, no medication, just herself standing tall. And in that moment, the story shattered. The girl who couldn't walk, could. The girl who was dying, wasn't. And the woman everyone thought was a saint. Well, she had been dead for days. I think what's so disturbing about this part of the story is how fast sympathy turned. One moment, people were crying for Gypsy, praying for her safe return. The next, they were staring at photos of her, walking, smiling, handcuffed, and no one knew what to believe anymore. It was no longer a murder case. It was something else entirely. Chapter 12. The truth unravels. When the police found Gypsy and Nick in Wisconsin, the initial reaction was relief. She was alive. After all the horror inside that house, after the Facebook post that read like a confession soaked in rage, Gypsy was alive. And for a few brief moments, people celebrated. But that didn't last long. Because as soon as authorities saw her walking, unassisted, steady, calm, it was like the air was sucked out of the room. No wheelchair, no oxygen tank, no trace of illness. And just like that, the story everyone thought they knew exploded. The girl who had lived in the public eye as a disabled child, who was treated like porcelain, whose mother had devoted her life to caring for her, had been lying, or worse, had been forced to lie. The truth hit like a punch to the gut. Gypsy wasn't sick, at least not physically. And she hadn't been for a long time. The interviews that followed were hard to watch. At first, Gypsy tried to fake surprise when detectives told her Dee Dee was dead. She acted shocked, confused, played innocent. But that facade didn't last, because Nick was already talking. He told investigators everything, how they met, what Gypsy had told him, the plan, the knife, the murder. And he made it clear it wasn't just his idea. Gypsy had asked him to do it. When they confronted her with that, the mask slipped. She confessed, slowly, quietly. She told them about the years of abuse, the medications, the lies, how she hadn't known her real age, how she wasn't allowed to go to school, how every part of her life had been manipulated and controlled by her mother. And I'll be honest, it was hard to process. Because how do you wrap your head around a girl who looks so young, so small, calmly explaining how she plotted her mother's death? But then again, how do you not feel something else entirely when she describes being force-fed medications, told she'd die without her mother, and beaten when she tried to tell the truth? That was the paradox of Gypsy Rose. Was she a victim? Absolutely. Was she a murderer? Technically, no Nick had wielded the knife, but she had helped plan it. She had asked for it. And the world wasn't ready for that kind of gray. We're taught to see victims and villains in black and white. But this case, it was murky, unsettling, layered with trauma and manipulation. It forced people to ask really uncomfortable questions about parenting, about the medical system, about justice, and most of all, about how far someone might go to escape a life that never belonged to them in the first place. What happened in that house wasn't just a crime, it was a cry for help that came far too late. Chapter 13. Judgment Day. The court system isn't built to handle stories like Gypsy Rose Blanchard's. It deals in facts, laws, verdicts, black and white, guilty or not guilty. But this case, it lived in the gray. After her confession, Gypsy was formally charged with second-degree murder. She faced the possibility of life in prison. But even prosecutors couldn't ignore what had come to light. They saw the medical records or the lack of them. They heard the testimony. The pills, the surgeries, the years of psychological torment. This wasn't just a case of a girl plotting to kill her mom. It was about a child who had been slowly erased by the person who gave her life. So they offered a plea deal, 10 years. No trial, no spectacle, no jury, just time. Gypsy took it. And honestly, I think she was relieved. For the first time, she had control. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She was sentenced to a decade behind bars, and I remember thinking how strange that was. She was going from one prison to another, but at least this time she knew the walls were real. Nick, on the other hand, didn't have that option. He was the one who had carried out the murder. The knife was in his hand. And even though Gypsy had helped plan it, even though he claimed he did it out of love, the law saw him differently. His mental health was brought up his autism diagnosis, his diminished capacity, but the jury didn't buy it. They found him guilty of first-degree murder and armed criminal action. And in 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison. No possibility of parole. It's strange, isn't it? They were both used, both manipulated, both emotionally unstable and deeply isolated. But only one would ever have a chance at freedom. And that sparked a national debate. Some people saw Gypsy as a murderer, plain and simple. She planned the crime. She played a role. She needed to be held accountable. Others saw a survivor, a victim of unspeakable abuse, a girl who had exhausted every option and finally snapped in the only way she knew how. I remember watching public opinion evolve in real time. At first, people were horrified. How could she do that to her own mother? But once the truth came out, it was like the world collectively gasped. The sympathy shifted. Not completely, but enough to make people think twice. Because the real question wasn't, was it wrong? It was, what would you have done in her place? And I think most of us don't have an answer for that. Chapter 14. The Girl Who Walked Away. When the dust settled and the courtroom emptied and the headlines began to fade, what was left was a question no one really knew how to answer. Who was Gypsy Rose Blanchard? Really? A murderer, a victim, a daughter trying to survive. Maybe all of the above. She's serving her sentence now, 10 years. She's due for parole in 2024. And from what I've read, she's doing well. Healthier, stronger, clearer than she's ever been. In prison, she gets to eat what she wants. She can walk freely. She's even earned her GED. It's ironic, isn't it, that she had to go to prison to find something close to freedom. And Nick, he's still behind bars. He'll be there for the rest of his life. No parole, no second chance. Just decades to replay what happened in that pink house in Missouri over and over in his mind. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if just one person had stepped in earlier. If that one doctor who suspected Munchausen by proxy had been taken seriously. If a teacher, a social worker, a neighbor, anyone had pushed a little harder. asked a few more questions. Maybe Dee Dee would still be alive. Maybe Gypsy wouldn't have had to choose between her mother's control and her own conscience. But that's the tragedy of this story. The failure wasn't just one moment. It was hundreds of little failures strung together over years, each one small enough to ignore until it wasn't. What Dee Dee did to Gypsy wasn't love. It was possession. And it's hard to even grasp the level of manipulation it takes to convince an entire community, a network of doctors, an entire nation, that your daughter is dying when she's not. But what's even harder to understand is how Gypsy was never really seen. Not as a person, not as a child, not as a girl who deserved her own life. She was a project, a symbol, a story people donated to and cried over. Until she flipped the script. I don't think Gypsy is proud of what she did, but I do believe she felt like it was the only way. And that doesn't make it right, it just makes it real. And that's the part that stays with me. Because this isn't just a true crime story. It's a story about survival, about control, about what happens when love turns into obsession, and when a child desperate to reclaim her life makes a choice that can't be undone. She walked away from the lie, but she'll carry the cost forever. And maybe, so will we. If you're still here, thank you for staying with me through this long and painful story. The case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard is one that lingers. It refuses to give us easy answers. And maybe that's the point, that some crimes aren't about monsters hiding in the dark. Sometimes they happen in plain sight, in places that look like love. What happened to Gypsy shouldn't have happened. And yet the signs were there. The systems were there. The people were there. But somehow, she was still alone. If this story moved you, made you think, or even made you uncomfortable, that's okay. That's what we do here. We sit with the hard truths and we echo them so they're not forgotten. Please consider subscribing to True Crime Echoes if you want more long-form stories like this, where we don't just retell the crime, we reflect on it. Take care of yourself, be kind to others, and remember, not all prisons have bars. Until next time.